Welcome to the Brain Tools podcast, where you're going to learn how your brain works and how you can use it to level up your life. It's practical brain science for everyday people. I'm your co-host Sam, a self-professed neuroscience nerd on a mission to share brain science with the world in words everyone can understand.
And I'm Kirun, and I specialise in neuroscience at university and now run a metacognition education startup in Asia. Each episode, you'll walk away with 6 practical brain tools that you can use immediately. No fluff, just the good stuff, with a side of banter.
Plus, grab our show notes, the research, and tons of other free resources, including guides and classes, just by joining our growing Brain Tools community at braintools.mn.co. Best of all, it's totally free. But for now, the Brain Tools podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to Brain Tools. This is episode 3 on fear. And fear can be construed in many different ways, and it's definitely something that has a role to play in our lives every day, whether or not we realize and recognize it. So today we're going to talk about some of the problems with fear, with chronic fear, how fear works in the brain, and then run through some really great information.
Sammy, it's a pop quiz.
Oh, God.
Sam,
oh, God.
Pop quiz time. Sorry, listeners. I just came in there. Sammy, I didn't want to prepare Sam for this. I feel really bad. But ladies and gentlemen, for those listening in, obviously Sam said we're talking about fear. What better way than to start with everyone's biggest fear, pop quiz time. So what we're going to do, Sam, putting you on the spot.
Absolutely triggered.
Literally on the spot, is what we're going to do is I was doing a little bit of research, going through a few websites, looking at the most common phobias. And as I'm sure listeners might know, phobias and fears have some odd names, some really weird names. So what we're going to do right now, I'm going to test Sam. I'm going to give him 5 different names, and his job is to tell me what that fear is based on the long word that I give him. So what I'd like you to do is play from home as well. God. So I want you to try and actually get these as we go along. Sam, this is your worst nightmare. I know you're all about alt ed. I'm bringing you back to summated assessment, man.
I'm having a fear response right now. I can feel my heart beating. I'm palpitating. All right, hit me. What you got?
You ready? Okay, I've got 5. I'm actually really pumped for this. So the first one I've got for you, nice and easy. What is arachnophobia?
Fear of spiders.
Good. 1 point. One out of 1. All right, we're going to go to number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you got the first one. Number 2, what is thalassophobia?
Thalassophobia.
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 Yeah, you're doing really well there, mate.
Things.
Mate. Down. No, it's fear of deep water, apparently.
I have that.
You've got 1 out of 2. 1 out of 2. All right, your next one. You ready?
Go on.
Galeophobia.
Galeophobia?
Definitely not pronouncing that right.
Fear of garlic?
Nah, unfortunately not. Fear of sharks. Legit.
Fear of sharks?
Very, very important. Sam, you're 33% right now. You're failing.
It's all right. It's just like university all over again.
All right, number 4. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're doing a lot better than Sam. Number 4. You ready? Glossophobia.
Glossophobia.
Yeah. GLOSSO.
Fear of glossy things.
Oh, mate, really? Now you're just not taking this seriously. Now you're literally doing 1 out of 4. Down. It is fear of public speaking.
Glossophobia. Interesting.
Yeah. And a fun fact for you, 1973, they did a paper around public speaking, and it was found that was the most common fear, so to speak, more so than the fear of death. But its peak, fear of death is still the number 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense.
I'm going to end with a very easy one. Okay.
Go on.
Number 5. What is claustrophobia?
Fear of being in small spaces.
Yes, there we go. 2 out of 5, ladies and gentlemen. Give him a round of applause. 40%. Still, look, you didn't pass, but it's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can tally up your scores, and I hope you did a lot better than Sam. But I wanted to start off a little bit differently because it segues quite nicely into what we're talking about today, which is obviously fear. And so I thought what I'd start by doing is just really unpacking what fear is based on what Sam said, because he was obviously experiencing that right then. I could see all the pupils dilating. I could see his heart racing. I could see him jumping. The sweat was very noticeable if you are watching the Zoom.
It's palpable. It's palpable.
Zoom replay. But Sammy, to just give you the definition, fear. Fear is apparently... Here, it is a negative sensation with the body or an aroused state in response to some form of stimuli. Classic. I said the word test. you were scared. It happened to me this morning, FYI. Saw a spider and I just like literally lurched back. And it is a very clear response and an adaptive response. And for those at home, last week we obviously were talking in well-being about chronic stress and chronic fear and how it's actually really important. There is eustress, which is the positive stress. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is really, really important, right? When we were back in our hunter-gatherers days, just doing our thing, if there was a threat nearby, like a tiger or something that was going to eat us, it kind of makes sense for us to have a response that says, oh no, fight or flight, we'll get to that later. There's a tiger. I'm probably not going to stay here right now. I probably need to go somewhere. And that was the whole idea that it was all about survival, right? If we follow natural selection. But it's been really interesting to note that fear, as we've progressed and Homo sapiens have evolved, our technology has been so rapidly changing our environment, especially in the last 100, 150 years. And we've tripled our life expectancy past 100 years. We're the richest from an absolute sense, economically, relatively not so much. And it becomes really interesting that our biological systems, our fear response, hasn't actually caught up to the environmental change. And that becomes a really interesting case for what fear is like in the 21st century, Sam, which is, I know we're thinking about the perfect environment or the perfect storm right now for fear.
So right. We've adapted for the savannah, but not the modern jungle, the concrete jungle of suburbia. But I wanted to bring this up, and I thought you'd find this useful, and that was a great segue. But so would the audience. The fact that we live in this perfect environment for fear to overpower the brain. And what I mean by that is currently we are surrounded by uncertainty and ambiguity, which triggers a fear response. It's the brain's way of dealing with a situation it doesn't know how to deal with by turning on that fear response, being ready to fight or flight, which we'll cover a little bit later. We're in a global pandemic. So the other thing that's happening now in terms of news is you think about all the stimuli, all the information coming into your brain, and it's all negative. It's all threat-based. It's all about this constant perpetual pandemic threat that's out there, which is creating this perfect environment for fear to run rampant. There's bad news every single day. It's creating this environment for fear to run rampant. And not only that, we're also living, Kirun, and I don't know if you agree with this, but we're also living in the age of anxiety.
For sure.
I mean, everyone is anxious these days. We all have things we're anxious about, and anxiety is really a manifestation of fear, a specific fear context. And it's just fear relabeled. So we're really in this environment where fear is able to thrive, which is interesting because I know you looked at fear in the context of the 21st century.
For sure. And I think when we talk about fear, you're so right in terms of the savannah. Like we're in the developed world at least, and I'm very mindful of saying that. Like it's not as if we've got tigers in our room. Right? It's not like we're facing existential threats every single day about we are going to die. But regardless, we still have those responses, like the fear of public speaking, the fear of like interacting with people. A lot of that social anxiety particularly is coming through. And I suppose there's three questions that I do want to pose to the audience that I think is really important to consider right now, which is like, one, what are you scared of is the really important part to look at. And right now in the 21st century, what role does fear play in your life or should play in your life? And then third is how do we then overcome that? And I think that's what we're going to really deep dive into to get really practical on like how you can actually overcome fear, which is something that people wrestle with and we wrestle with daily. Like, to be honest with you, Sam, I know we were talking personally about our fears, and like one fear I've got, which again is probably a lot of people's, like, I'm so scared of heights, which I know is not the existential part of that, but like, I'm so scared of it. I get close to an edge and I'm like, I need to retreat massively.
What's the phobia for that, Kirun?
I'm just gotta look that up right here. No.
That wasn't on the podcast. Yeah.
What about you? Have you scared anything?
Look, scared of podcasting mostly is number one fear. No, I used to have a massive fear of talking to strangers, and we're actually going to cover a little bit later in this podcast an implementation I used, a brain tool I used to overcome that fear. But right now, my biggest one is I'm personally terrified of posting on TikTok, which sounds super weird. Why should I care? Yeah. It's a social platform. It's a social channel. It's not, for me, not because of being judged, but because I'm trying to get my videos right. And I'm so worried that I'm going to produce something that doesn't work for the audience. And it's not going to work for my brand, which is ridiculous. But that's my personal fear right now. to open up a little bit.
God, so many deep and meaningful. Ladies and gentlemen, we're 10 minutes in and we're really talking about deepest, darkest fears right now. Mine being heights, Sam's being TikTok.
Yeah, it's a bit of a contrast. A little bit. Mine's very 21st century. The thing is, it doesn't matter if it's TikTok you're afraid of and causing that fear response, or if it's heights. That same threat response, that same fear response in the amygdala is going to be the exact same. And there are a whole bunch of problems with this, which we're about to cover in the next section, where we talk about the problems of fear. What are some of the problems with fear? Well, I want to start off by saying this. If you're at home, even with the best training, preparedness, even exercising, eating well, and doing all the right things, fear can still take over. Your amygdala can still be hijacked, which is where fear happens in the brain. Because fear is this really primal, innate thing. And what fear is it's an associative response to a certain context or stimuli. And what I mean by that is it's your brain seeing something, hearing something, smelling something, feeling something, and associating that with danger. And when that happens, there's a physiological response in your body where your body is now preparing itself. It's now preparing itself for that danger. And there are a whole bunch of things that happen. Cortisol is released, which is the stress hormone, through the secretion of ACTH, just a whole bunch of neurotransmitters. As your brain prepares your body and your muscles to get ready to move, adrenaline is pumped through your system. And the important thing to know here is that these fear responses, you would have felt them yourself now, right? Okay, and so with your fear of heights, or with my fear of TikToks, you get clammy hands, your heartbeat increases, the tension in your muscle starts to increase, and you feel like your body is getting ready to move. And it's kind of this response which people generally label as fight or flight. But that's not necessarily right these days. And Kirun actually has some really interesting research which might just blow your mind on this.
I'm chewing at the bit on this because, as Sam's saying, it's so true. It's such an involuntary response. And we just want to reiterate, it's so important. Like, it has been so important. Like, if there is something dangerous, you do not want to die. So fear is actually your friend sometimes. But what they found very interestingly with this whole fight or flight business is that might not necessarily be the entire story. And Sammy, I want to talk to you about an experiment, 2018. Stanford. So Stanford have a lab that's all about sort of fear and visual responses. Some very, very interesting work. And there's two experiments that I think the listeners and viewers and yourself, hopefully, will really enjoy. Now, what the first experiment was all about is they basically got mice, okay, in the box, right? Sam, I want you to imagine your room is a box and you're the mouse. I'm really sorry because it's kind of COVID-19 right now. This is kind of how it is. And I think you know that. So you're in there. Then basically what happened is over the box, they actually showed like a big shadow or a big figure. And the whole idea was to elicit the fear response in the mouse. And what was really fascinating about this, and Sam, you spoke about the amygdala, like the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, that interaction, where obviously fear is in the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, for the ladies and gentlemen listening, all about the CEO of your brain, right? The rational thought. What was super interesting is that they found in nature, fight's not a thing. Like, if it is, such a small proportion of animals actually fight. Right? But we've applied this whole idea that people either fight or flight. The reality is what they actually found was two things. It was freeze or flight. That was the most common response for these mouse to this particular thing, and learned over time, obviously, because exposure is really important. The more you expose a mouse to this thing, they learn it. If they don't get a bad consequence, it's okay. But that became really, really interesting to note that we might have got this whole axis wrong. That, like, we might not actually be on the fight or flight axis at all. Like, I know freeze has come in recently, but you might have to remove fight altogether, which, mate, it's a bit interesting, which I find. What do you think?
That is like really, really interesting, because we're obviously taught, if you do study neuroscience or psychology or any of those things, that it's fight or flight. Everyone knows fight or flight, you know? That's what your body's doing, fight or flight response. And it's one of those commonalities kind of thrown around. But this new research is suggesting that might not be the case. And I can actually personally attest to this. I don't remember ever being scared and thinking I'm going to lash out. It's usually I'm having a fear response. I want to get out of that situation, or I just panic and stop altogether.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it was so interesting that they did a second experiment. So when I said to the listeners and viewers at home that you are literally in a box, and I want you to imagine this, they actually replicated what they did with the mouse with humans. They literally got a room, scaled it up, and they had humans inside it. And what they've been using, which I've been so fascinated by, VR, virtual reality, is they actually use virtual reality to elicit some sort of fear response. So they'd see, for example, attack dogs or a shark, some of the common phobias that Sam obviously failed at in his test. Now, the key thing, sorry, mate, had to give you a drive-by there. But what was super, super interesting is, first and foremost, obviously novelty is a massive factor in the magnitude of your fear response, right? How new, how foreign it is really important. But what they found very, very clearly in this part of the brain, which I thought was really interesting, is you actually have sort of neurons that are linked with courage. So when they actually found that, they had an electrode through the amygdala as well, and that if you actually pressed on certain neurons in this courage center, it made people more likely to stay there and actually freeze or, I suppose, confront what they were doing. But obviously when they pressed on the amygdala one, it was more likely to run away, which is really, really interesting. And the whole idea that this ties to is what Sam was talking about earlier, and we talked about in the wellbeing episode, which is this overstimulation of the amygdala, your salient center, your threat detector. Overstimulation of that leads to chronic stress. And once it's chronic, that actually leads to a bunch of psychiatric issues, which is one of the biggest problems we speak about: anxiety, depression. Now, if you haven't seen the wellbeing episode or listened to it, I highly recommend you go through that. But what I want to pass over to you, Sam, just to give the listeners who haven't seen that, just a bit of an understanding of this whole chronic stress, this fear response idea.
Yeah, definitely go listen to that episode like Kirun just referenced, and stick around because we are going to talk about practical stuff that is coming up. But this chronic fear response actually has physical changes to the brain, which is really crazy. So what happens in a state of chronic fear or chronic stress, because the hormones are the same, is parts of the brain responsible for learning, the hippocampus, the hippocampal cells, shrink. And parts of the brain responsible for thinking, the PFC that Kirun alluded to earlier, which is responsible for all your really processing and high level functioning, also shrinks. But the part of your brain, responsible for fear, responsible for that response, grows. So over time, people who are chronically anxious or chronically stressed, one and the same when it comes to the hormonal response, they get better at being chronically stressed and chronically anxious and chronically afraid, while also decreasing their ability to learn and decreasing their ability to think. Which is really huge self-fulfilling prophecy. Absolutely. It's and there's all these things that are happening at a hormonal and neurotransmitter level in the brain, which is why this response happens in the hippocampus and the PFC. It's actually a protective mechanism, but it basically just means that being chronically afraid or chronically anxious has really like long-term repercussions for how you can think and learn new things, which leads really well into your research you did around self-actualization and overcoming fear and the problems there.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point, ladies and gentlemen, just to sort of stop and prop, which is obviously give dues to the idea of chronic stress and the psychiatric disorders that come with it, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety. What's a really interesting one to think about though these days is Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about self-actualization being at the top, right? Which is your meaning, your overall purpose in life. And because we've gotten so much richer, because we're satisfying in most parts of the world those basic physiological and safety needs, we're getting to the point where we're sort of asking ourselves, what does this all mean? And I don't want to get so deep and meaningful, but this whole idea of living a full life, or eudaimonia, as we said last time, meaning and purpose being really important. So, Sammy, I want to give you a quote that I saw the other day. And I'm not going to lie, it slammed at me like a ton of bricks. I just want to see if you have the same reaction. You ready?
Hit me.
Confucius, pretty wise man. He said once, humans have two lives. The second starts when you realize you have one.
Oh,
mic drop.
Deep.
So deep though, right?
Very deep.
But it hits you like that because you realize, and you're sort of sitting there being like, hold on, what is Confucius trying to say? He's like arguably saying that we waste a lot of time, but we waste a lot of time in fear. And the key thing to understand is like, what are you actually scared of? And Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, the former Facebook CIO, in her book Lean In, she talks about this question repeatedly. And she's always saying, what would I do if I wasn't afraid? What would I actually do if I wasn't crippled by fear? And reaching that purpose, and I know this seems quite motivational, I don't mean to get all Tony Robbins on you, but the whole idea of like discomfort is arguably where the most growth comes from. And this is where it becomes really interesting that this whole idea of discomfort, and they've done a bunch of research into this, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. While fear and pain, they're useful and they protect us from harm, we often get the causation wrong. Like our brain as a heuristic, we often get what is actually causing the fear wrong. So a really good example of this is public speaking, arguably something that people really struggle with. And you spoke about that earlier, in that when we go up on stage, we say, I'm scared of public speaking. And what happens is you go on stage, again, self-fulfilling prophecy, where you actually end up presenting to someone. It doesn't necessarily go well in your opinion. And you say, I'm not good at public speaking. I don't want to do it again. But you've actually got the attribution completely wrong. It's not that public speaking is actually causing you the fear or the stress. It's actually the people not reacting positively to you that is actually causing that. You're actually worried about the external thing, and that's the actual cause. But the public speaking itself is not the cause. And so this is where we have a tendency to overgeneralize our fear responses without really unpacking it. I know we're going to get to the idea of implementation, talking about CBT, and really using our prefrontal cortex to engage, like, what am I actually scared of? Why am I scared of? What does it look like? But I put that forward to be like, that's probably the big problem right now, is like, what are you not doing that you should be doing?
So are you kind of saying here, and probably really true today, that we think we're afraid of the wrong things? Yep,
spot on. But we learned.
So we learned exactly right, because fear is associative. It's actually fear conditioning. They call them fear memories, where your brain learns to have a fear response to a certain context, a certain stimuli, and in a situation that would be a public speaking situation, and the context is people responding negatively, but then you assume it's the actual public. That is so interesting.
It might be really subtle, but I can, like, if when you really, really look down, it's that whole idea of actually analyzing, why am I scared of public speaking? Yeah. Going one level deeper to the actual causative element. And that's what we're going to talk about in these brain tools that we implement, is to actually get to those things that would actually give you meaning, where discomfort, is going to lead to that growth. Like, obviously, how do you get to that situation? But once you're in that situation, what do you do? And I think that's going to be really, really interesting as we move into, obviously, what overcoming fear and the benefits of doing so, and actually how to get that done.
Yeah, which I'm really excited for. We've got some really unique brain tools coming up. So stick around, they're coming around soon. But that's super interesting, and it leads directly into our next segue, which is, the benefits of overcoming or mastering your fear.
Awesome. Now we're back, obviously, to now look at, when we overcome fear, what is actually the benefit of doing so? And I know, Sam, if we overcome fear, it's a really, really important thing, but there's some really clear benefits that you've looked at on a real micro-specific level that I know you want to share with the audience. Hit me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this because I've felt them myself personally. From a micro level, when you learn how to quasi-control your fear response, or to manage it more actively in the moment, you're able to do so many more things, because you can now take action. And when you think about fear, what it does is it's trying to stop your body from taking action. That's what happens when your amygdala becomes hijacked, when your body shuts down and gets ready to freeze or flight, not fight, as Kirun said. Your body and your brain is being prepared not to do anything. So learning how to overcome and manage this fear response, or reduce its impact on you, is really, really powerful in the micro, because you can start to take control of some of those psychosomatic experiences you had, those fear responses where your body tenses up and you can't think as well and your memory doesn't seem to work, and now you're stressing about a million different things. That fear response, being able to control it in the moment, is really, really powerful, because it suddenly unlocks your ability to take action, which leads directly into some of the personal growth stuff that I know you're about to cover, Kirun, and I'm really, really interested in.
Yeah, and just on that point, Sam, I think that's super, super interesting. That's the thing that everyone associates with, is those physical, really, really visceral feelings of stress. Like, I think that's the thing everyone sort of can associate with, like, especially like pre-race when you're doing something or anything like that. It becomes crippling. And I think that sort of segues really nicely into a quote by a guy called George Washington Nair. And I think it sums up where we want to get to as a community pretty quickly, which is, everything you've ever wanted is sitting on the other side of fear. I'm going to repeat that. Everything you've ever wanted is sitting on the other side of fear. And I think the key thing to be mindful of is that personal growth, that motivation, that focus, that eudaimonia that is on the other side of fear, is a really interesting to think about, but it's so hard to see. Like, it's so hard to see the benefit and the good of going through something that so very clearly, visually and viscerally feels uncomfortable and feels bad. But it's that whole idea of like no pain, no gain, right? And so the question you got to ask yourself is, how do you actually, what tools can you use in order to actually go through that experience to get to the other side? And how do you tame that inner voice in your head that says, don't do this, don't do this? And how do you say, shut up, I'm doing this?
And that's such a good quote. And what tools can you use? Well, lucky for you, we're about to share some tools with you. That brings us into our next section, implementations, the brain tools section. This is the part of the show I know you've been waiting for, the practical, implementable brain tools that you can use today to start conquering your fear, to manage it, to really mitigate its effect and impact on your life. And Kirun, I know you had some context to how these brain tools work and help understand people why they work. So maybe it's best to start with that.
Great handball, Sammy. Yeah, I think with the brain tools we're about to give you, and I think it's the same context as to last week, this whole notion of neuroplasticity. And I was doing a bit of research for this episode, and there's this guy called Dr. Andrew Huberman. He was actually the person that's sort of leading the Stanford team. And he has this awesome phrase that I think Norman Joy would love when the book, The Brain Changes Itself. And it's called self-directed adaptive plasticity. Now, it sounds really wanky. I'm going to be honest with you.
Break that down a little bit. That is complicated.
So all it means is you can change your brain by taking action. And the key thing is that inaction is not actually the way that you want to go about this. And you've got this whole idea of controlled exposure to fear stimuli, as you said, which helps you update your neural architecture. And I think we've been constantly convinced that when you're an adult, you can't change your brain. It's false. You totally can. But the barrier to entry to changing your brain is a lot more difficult because you've got a lot of preconceptions. And I think the key thing here to understand is the difference between what you think is real versus what actually is real. And a way I normally try and think about it is you want your what actually is, minus what you think it is, to be zero. That means that your idea of reality is at base level 1. And when you do this, you have a really clear understanding of actually changing and having control over what you're going to do. And that's the classic case when it comes to fear. Is Seneca, one of the greats? I know you love him, Sam, and listeners, if you haven't, Seneca's Letters of a Stoic are great, all about stoicism. If he says, and I'm going hard on the quotes today, if you would not have a human flinch when the crisis comes, train them before it comes. By Seneca. And this whole idea of simulation, of practice, of exposing yourself to things means that when the time actually arrives, it's okay. It's normal. That's why in the military, as an example, it's simulation after simulation after simulation. And I think that's where I want to pass over to you, Sam, in terms of your first brain tool, which is incredibly practical from an identification point of view. So I think we dive in.
Yeah, I love that. And it's something the Navy SEALs always say is that we don't rise to our level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training, right? That's just the way we respond as humans in stressful situations. And I want to talk about the first brain tool I'm going to give you is how you can control fear in the micro, in that very moment you're experiencing it, doing something really, really simple. Write down your emotion. What happens is when you write down your emotion in the exact word, you pull away resources away from the brain responsible for fear, the amygdala, and you shift them to the prefrontal cortex and the language areas of your brain, the language processing areas, Broca's and Wernicke's area, and it actually reduces the fear response. And they have done some research on this where they basically got a whole bunch of people into a lab, and they stressed them out. They gave them really stressful stimuli, like really scary images, things they were afraid of. Maybe it was heights for someone like Kirun. And then they asked them to write down in their own words the exact emotion they felt. And the important part is to write down the emotion, the word for the emotion, whether that was stressed, panicked, worried, frightened. And what they found using fMRI, scanning the brains, was activity in the amygdala reduced, while activity in the PFC and other parts of the brains increased, and their physiological fear response, which they measure by skin conductance, the stress response, reduced. Crazy. Crazy.
That's massive, because what you're saying, which I find really interesting, is that just the simple act of noting the emotion means that, like, it's almost as if your PFC, your CEO, is being engaged that through that act of writing, which means that, as you said, it's sort of increasing the activity in that part of the brain. And then the CEO, the bouncer, is taming the limbic system, the animal that sometimes runs wild.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's such an easy one to do. This is the brain tool when you are feeling stressed or when you are experiencing a fear response. Get out a piece of paper, get out a pen, and in your own word, write the emotion down. And that process of turning the emotion into language circumvents and shortcuts and short circuits the fear response. So that's my first one, which actually leans really well into your first brain tool, which is all about words too, in a different way.
For sure. And I think my first one as a higher level is to document all the stories that you tell yourself. And Sam, I think it was a really interesting point you talk about emotion. And as we're talking with the listeners, you've got to ask yourself, like, how does emotion manifest itself? And it normally manifests itself through story. But the story is not that we just tell other people, but the stories that we tell ourselves. And I'm a quote machine today, Sammy, but Richard Feynman, who I love, Nobel Prize winning laureate again, he said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest to fool. And that whole idea of self-delusion is really, really pronounced. We tell our stories, self-stories, that obviously based on this emotion that convinces us of not taking action. And it comes that self-fulfilling prophecy that leads us not to do anything. And so to get really, really practical, if it takes Sam's idea of noting the emotion, from a recognition standpoint, ask yourself, what stories do I tell myself based on fear? And to get really practical, and I can share this with you, I've started recently with one of my mates, Ollie, who I'm reconnecting with in Melbourne. And he introduced me to this whole idea of IFS, and it's called internal family systems. For those that don't know much about it, I'll put it in the show notes, but it's just basically a form of therapy. And it basically posits that the whole is made up of parts, and those parts are personalities, and you want to talk to those individual parts. So for me, one of my individual parts I've got is the analytical part, if you haven't noticed already, which is this clear, Sam's laughing because he knows this in our meetings. It's like, Kirun, you bloody robot, what are you doing? Analyzing everything.
You guys should say the Google Docs we have. The analysis is incredible.
But this whole idea of IFS, and the principle I want to give you practically is find a person that you trust. Genuinely trust, and actually schedule into your calendar every single week for 30 to 30 minutes, maybe to an hour, and actually speak about the stories that you might tell yourself. And I've done this with Ollie over the past 2 weeks, and over the first one was a bit awkward. The second one was so much easier because I got used to the discussion point. But that self-awareness feedback loop of actually saying, hey, what I think is versus what actually is so far removed that it gives you that context to be like, hey, maybe this story isn't beneficial to me. Maybe it's based on fear, and the fear is all inside my head. As Naval Ravikant says, it's not peace of mind, it's peace from mind. And I think that becomes a really important tool that we can link, hopefully for you as listeners, noting the emotion, but looking at what the story is that is manifested as a result of that emotion.
Totally. Can I add a tiny bit of color commentary to that, some context? So you talked about self-prophecies or self-fulfilling prophecies. There is actually a brain mechanism that lives inside your head that make these a reality. And it's called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And what its function is to do is to confirm evidence of things you already believe or think. So as Kirun says, if you're having these fear conditioned memories, responses, and thoughts or narratives, your RAS will look for information that confirms these exist. It's called confirmation bias. There's a whole bunch of research on it. And this is why it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because your brain starts to discredit information that disagrees with this viewpoint, that says, no, Kirun, you're not afraid of this, while actively seeking out information that says, yes, Kirun, you are afraid of this. And that's where the perpetual cycle comes in. It's not us talking about it. It's a function of your brain, the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Super, super interesting. And I think it's really important that we note on this one that Sammy and I aren't psychiatrists, and we're not psychologists, and we're not going to sit here and say that you should do this to solve something like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? There's obviously professionals for that. I think where we're coming from here is in the moment, in the everyday capacity, using it as a tool, or having it as a tool or mechanism that you can use, as opposed to saying this is going to be the silver bullet that solves some deep-rooted problems. And I just want to, I know it's a classic disclaimer, but I want to be really mindful about that for people that are listening, to say that this is not medical advice, or this is not psychology advice. This is just what's worked for us.
If you need help, go and get help.
Yep.
We're not professionals in this space. We're just suggesting a couple of things you can do that are practical to help in the moment or from the research. And whether or not they work is going to be dependent on you and how you use them. And if you do need help, I encourage you, reach out, get therapy, get professional help, because it'll be much more tailored to your situation. But I want to talk about my next brain tool,
number 2,
which was brain tool number 2 and related to my own experience and situation. And it was exposure therapy, or brain tool 2, baby steps. And the idea behind this one is whatever you're afraid of, you want to expose yourself in small, tiny ways that don't induce a massive fear response to that stimulus or to that certain situation or environment. And over time, increase your exposure. And what this does is it kind of rewires your brain and retrains your brain to decrease that threat response in response to this situation or circumstance. And I'll give you a personal example.
I'm ready.
I used to be terrified of talking to strangers. In public, it made me really nervous. I was that little boy who wouldn't even talk to a cashier. I'd get my sister, who was 2 years younger than me, to go in and order for me.
Wow.
I couldn't call up shops. I really couldn't engage with people who I didn't know. I was terrified. And I knew this was a bit of a problem for me. So when I started going through university and acknowledged that, hey, this is definitely not a way I can go throughout life. I don't have someone there all the time to talk to random cashiers for me. I started using a bit of exposure therapy, which is based in cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a really well-established discipline. And I started getting small bits of exposure. So maybe it was a couple of words exchanged with a cashier or someone I was talking to at a shop front. And then I'd expand that out to a couple more words the next week with some people at like a bus stop or a train stop. And eventually, over time, I exposed myself to the point where I was having casual conversations with people I'd never met. And I went from being terrified of talking to someone on the phone who was taking my order, which is not a stressful situation for 95% of the population, to being able to talk to almost anyone in any situation purely by exposing myself in baby steps to that situation which was causing me stress.
That's huge, mate. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you and level. I didn't know this, but it's pretty nuts to think like we're doing a podcast now. We're having conversations. I seen you interact with other people, and the fact that this was something that was pretty crippling for you, it really surprises me. And I think that raises a huge point, which is like, we don't, just because people have an outward appearance doesn't necessarily mean that's consistent with what's going on inside.
Totally agree. And I know this to be true with so many people I know who appear externally confident, but are often dealing with debilitating fear or anxiety, as I was in that situation. And this really leads into how you can expand that fear. So my brain tool is get exposure over time, baby steps, but expanding out what you're comfortable with. Kirun, did you have a brain tool for that?
Oh, yes, I do. And it links so nicely.
How did I know?
We're syncing. My number 2 is, I'm going to talk about Seneca a bit as well, but it's to practice discomfort once a week. And I think what Seneca in his letters talks a lot about is that poverty is both a mindset and a condition. And he talks a lot about the conditions or the environments of what poverty is. And he's got a quote here because I don't want to just get it wrong and I need to attribute it to him. But he basically says, set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, is this the condition that I fear? And I think that is so interesting that he would practice poverty, if you will, every single week. So he wouldn't sleep on his bed, for example. He'd sleep on the floor. He'd wear the scantiest clothes and ask himself that if this is meant to be the worst situation or one of how bad actually is it? And again, it's that whole idea of correcting what you think it is versus what it actually is. And to get really, really, really practical, you need to just be mindful of the way your brain plays tricks on you. Now, to get super practical on how you could do this, for me, from personal experience, I remember trying this when I was really getting into stoicism. And all I do to start is twice a week, I'd sleep on my floor. Instead of my bed, I'd sleep on my floor. And I would literally just get used to that and realize, hey, look, maybe my neck hurts a little bit, but this isn't that bad. Right. And then I went a step further. And instead of wearing like some nice clothes, sorry, mum, and thank you very much for getting them for me, but I would just literally just wear the same set of clothes over and over and over and over again. Just because like, hey, if I only have this set of clothes and I had to wash them, I can. And I think getting experience with an alternate reality that might seem uncomfortable from a distance, but actually when you come to it and you're right near it, it's not actually that bad. And I know this might seem like coming from a very privileged thing. It's like, we've got clothes, we've got all these things. There's a lot of people in the world that don't. But I think practicing that deliberately, and to get practical, put that as a theme on your calendar. So quite literally putting it as a theme on my calendar is like, I know this is going to happen on a Saturday or a Sunday. Pick that day that you do this. And I think that then extends to something that Sam and I are thinking about for the Brain Tools community, but is sort of an idea of a 30-day discomfort challenge, where we actually seek things that make us feel uncomfortable, and we do it obviously as a community together. But it's a frequency part. What gets scheduled gets done. So if you do have something that you want to make you feel uncomfortable, put it in your calendar. If you're going to actually do it, put it in there and practice it, because as Sam said, over time, it's really important, the actual act itself. And then what becomes important is the frequency. So to bring the tool together, I suppose, is to practice that fear, practice that discomfort every single week, because that exposure over time makes your expectation and reality go to zero.
Crazy. So it's just like expanding out your fear comfort circle, so to speak, deliberately by scheduling it in.
Spot on, Savvy. And hopefully on the other side, as we say, the good stuff is on the other side of that discomfort.
Oh yeah, powerful. I like that. I've had that as my own personal experience of practicing discomfort. I actually used to do fasts for a while. I do 3-day water only fasts, and I found afterwards, I was more confident in myself over time, because I knew I could do something as uncomfortable as that.
Makes so much sense, mate. And to pass it on to you, I know you've been gnawing at the bit on this one. So just for the listeners, Sammy came to me with this, be like, Kirun, I've found something really recent research-wise that it's going to blow your mind. I haven't heard it yet. So he's been talking it up big time. I know he's going to deliver. But Sammy, what's your third and final brain tool that you want to share?
Oh, yeah. Brain tool number 3. I'm so excited for this. It is really recent research, and it's called counter conditioning. And what it means, and that sounds like a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo, but here's the brain tool. Reward yourself for exposure to the thing that induces you fear, but with just the picture. Reward yourself to what causes you fear with just the picture. And I'll tell you why, because research found that doing this short circuits the brain's fear response and replaces it and reroutes it towards a reward. And there's a research that was done in 2016 by Kirun et al. In the Nature of Human Behavior. And what they did was essentially they took an image. They took this photo. And the image basically represented the fear-inducing stimulus that the people in the experiment were exposed to. And they just took a photo of it that didn't have the same resonance, and it only kind of similarly replicated it. And they gave these people over 5 days, they gave them rewards for seeing this stimulus. And in this example, it was a red circle. And day 1, they saw the red circle, they got a reward. Day 2, they saw the red circle, they got a reward. Day 3, by day 5, when they showed the threat stimulus, they showed the image which was threatening, not the red circle, but the actual image itself. And they measured perspiration, skin conductance, and other measurements of stress and fear. The threat and fear response had just dropped through the floor. And these people, all they've been doing is looking at a photo and getting a reward. Crazy. It's so that they called it hacking the brain to overcome fear without exposure to that thing causing the fear. And here's the practical way you can do this. If you're afraid of something, whether that's, let's use spiders as an example. If you're afraid of spiders, what you could do is look at just a photo of a spider, or maybe even a cartoon spider, something that doesn't cause you a massive threat or fear response, and reward yourself for doing that. Eat a piece of chocolate. And if you do this over time, what happens is you rewire your brain's circuit towards reward of that threat stimulus subconsciously without even having to feel afraid. And I'll just quickly give you how I'm doing this personally. Please. I told you I was a little bit afraid of posting TikToks. What I've been doing is I've been watching people recently post TikToks and record TikToks. And then after watching that, I just eat a piece of chocolate. And I've found that now when I go to record a TikTok and post it, I have this weird thing where my brain thinks, oh, wow, this is good. I'm probably going to get a piece of chocolate. Like there's this reward response in my brain, and it's making it so much less scary for me, which is crazy.
That's awesome, mate. One thing I'm going to say, mate, one of us has already got diabetes. We don't need two of us having diabetes, all right? So, but the premise is very interesting, that whole idea of exposure through a visual and the pairing of reward, which it shows how very clearly, and I'm mindful of conjecture, but there is a lot of research done in the role that dopamine plays within the fear response in the limbic system. Yep. So this whole idea of reward and fear being a very clear learned sort of relationship or dichotomy is a really interesting 100%. One. I think that's very, very, very interesting.
So crazy. And if I can say it in one sentence, right, this brain tool is figure out what you're afraid of, look at photos of it or a visual representation that doesn't make you afraid, and give yourself a reward. And doing that over time rewires your brain so you'll be less afraid of it. And you don't even have to do anything.
That's huge. I love it.
Huge. Which is crazy. And I know it kind of leads into the last brain tool you have for us, which I'm really excited about. And it's more about systems.
Spot on. And I think the third one is create and trust systems with people, not your willpower. Now, I know that's a long-winded one, but I'm going to break it down, okay?
Please give us the details.
And in preparing for our 4th episode, Sammy, which is going to be on habits and sort of routines, I was reading Atomic Habits by James Clear in preparation for it. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be talking about that in next week's episode, so look out for it. And he's got a quote that is so similar to what you talked about with the Navy SEALs, but it hit me. Quote, I think we need a quote count. I think this is quote 10, but
we should get paid by quotes. I would love some affiliate marketing quotes. If anyone does that out there, we are open to opportunities.
So the quote is as follows: people don't rise to their goals, they fall to their systems. That's by James Clear. And it really thought about it, which is that, sorry?
Can you break that down a bit?
I'm going to break it. So we always have a tendency with this whole idea. Let's just take fear as an idea. We think about the ideal of where we want to be, right? And we think about setting all these goals, like I want to overcome this, I want to do that. We don't actually think about how we could design our life so that we are, again, exposed to things and we're actually acting on that. So the classic question that I'm asking yourself is like, if we want to overcome a fear, there's 2 parts. What's the system that you can create? And that if you fall over and your willpower is not there, which again, I think a massive misnomer is to rely on your willpower a lot. Don't rely on your system. What's the system that you can create? I'm going to get tangible in a second, but based on that system, then putting someone with that system. And that's what we call a social accountability. So for example, and this is a nice leeway into next week, but Sammy, if I wanted to run, as a really clear example, and I was scared of running, I was scared of the exercise and the response that I was doing, there's a really practical system that I can create, which is I can put my shoes right next to my bed, right? I might not mean I'll do it, but I'm going to increase the probability because going for a run's really hard. Putting on my shoes is not that hard, right? And you talked about that baby step. The next thing I could do is I could set 3 alarms. The next thing I could do is I could get Sammy, we might do this, to call me at 7 o'clock. And the next thing I could do is say, hey, Sam, meet me here at 7:15. And you start to introduce a social accountability component. And if there's one thing we've learned about human history, and I don't think this is a great thing, but it is what it is collective suffering's a lot easier than individual suffering. And the whole idea of suffering together, right, and having someone there that can guide you is actually a really important part. So for all these tips we've spoken about, involving someone that you trust in the process means that if you fail to reach for the stars, at the very minimum, your mean, your average, your systems get you there. And so you want to make sure you think about it. So getting really practical is a final one. Once you've done that system and designed it, which we'll talk about next week, you track your progress. It's a wall tracker. It's ticking off so you have a positive feedback loop that, hey, I'm actually doing this over and over and over again. It could be just a calendar where you do X and you do the Seinfeld method, right? Where you start to build up this momentum. And hey, presto, after 7 times, 8 times habit, you've broken down those barriers. And hey, who knows? You might have overcome your fear.
That's so powerful. And I've actually used this without even realizing I was using it in my own life. So for example, I used to, the fittest I've ever been in my life was when me and a friend lived near each other's houses and we made each other sprint 3 times a week by just showing up at the other person's house. If I woke up before him, I'd show up at his house. If he woke up before me, he'd show up at my house. That's super interesting. Systems. And like, there's a final one on that, public speaking. Like I've been fortunate to train hundreds of people in public speaking based on the work that we do. And one thing that we've built into the system is to always make sure that people are preparing in pairs and that they're doing it in pairs. They're going back and forth. They build a relationship so it becomes a safer space. And that's the whole idea and premise, which I know we're going to speak in another episode of psychological safety, which it creates that safety net. So those tools that we've given hopefully
are going to increase the probability of you overcoming your fears.
Totally. And just to wrap up those tools and cover them again, my 3 were: 1, write down the emotion you're experiencing in the moment to reduce the fear response. 2, baby steps. It's called exposure therapy in CBT, and basically getting exposed to what makes you scared in tiny little minute ways and stair step up over time reduces that response. And 3, counter conditioning or reconditioning, which is look at an image, the thing that you're actually afraid of, something that doesn't trigger a big fear response, and reward yourself for looking at it. And those are my 3. What were your 3, Kiers?
Rapid fire 3. Number 1, based on what Tame said, document all the stories that you tell yourself. Stories are a manifestation of the emotion. Document the stories you tell yourself so that you are aware of them and you can overcome them. Number 2 is practice and seek discomfort once a week at the minimum. Take the absolute bare bones, sleep on the floor, do whatever you will that is considered discomfort, and you'll realize very quickly it's not as bad as it seems. And the final one, number 3, is create systems with social accountability. Don't trust yourself, and I mean that in the nicest way. Trust your systems because you'll always revert back to them.
Love it. Super, super powerful. I think those are some really great brain tools people can start using today. As our episode outro to leave you with the 80-20, what is the 20% you could do for 80% of the impact, Kirun? What's your 80-20 for this week?
What do you think I'm going to go with? Oh, it's a quote. Shock, 11.
Oh, wow. Shock and horror.
Everyone's going to hate me after this, but I'm going to quote scream. Henry Ford this time. I want to leave you with this, listeners. One of the greatest discoveries a person can make, one of their great surprises, is that they find that they can do what they were afraid to do.
Oh, powerful. I wish I had a quote like that. Yeah, I'm going to go with my own self-created quote, which has nowhere near the eloquence of Henry Ford. My simple 80-20 is when you are feeling scared, witless, write it down. Write down your feelings, write down your thoughts, your emotions particularly, label them, because just doing this just doing this reduces the fear response. So write it down. Journal.
Here's a pen.
Write it down. Here's the pen. Thank you so much for joining us again for another episode of Brain Tools. Really excited for next week's episode, Kirun. What are we talking about next week?
I do know what we're going to be talking about next week. I've got this right. We're going to be talking about habits and routines and how you can obviously build those to live a better life.
Super powerful and super relevant right now. I know a lot of people in my network, a lot of my friends and family are struggling with their routines and habits, so disrupted. So that's going to be amazing. Look out for that coming up next week. And also come and join us in our community, in our Brain Tools community, which you're going to hear a bit more information about just after this. And that's about it for me for this week. Bye for this week.
See you later, guys.
See you guys. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Brain Tools. We've got 3 quick things to hit you with before you go. 1, if you want to hear other Brain Tools, you can find our other episodes at the link below and on all podcasting platforms.
Number 2, if you like this episode, then give us a review on iTunes or Spotify, only if it's above 4 stars.
And number 3, you can go ahead and join the braintools.mn.co community, where we'll post a complete brain guide based on this episode, plus a ton of other resources. Best of all, it is completely free.
Cannot wait to see you next episode. And until then, bye for now.
See you next episode.